The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Not the natural breathing silence of the desert, but a hollow, man-made quiet. In the immense labyrinthine canyons of southern Utah, a local stockman named Clayton Porter, riding through the desolate landscape in late November 1934, saw something that didn't belong. Two burros wandering alone. They were Everett's burros, though Porter didn't know it at the time. Their tracks told a story of days, perhaps weeks, spent without a master. Their presence an anomaly in the vast, empty stage of the Escalante wilderness. They were healthy, their bellies full from the sparse winter vegetation, but their packs, the tools, the food, the very evidence of human purpose were gone. Porter, assuming they were strays from a prospector, simply herded them to a nearby ranch. No alarm was raised. The desert continued to keep its secret. Months passed. The silence stretched from Utah all the way to California, where Everett's parents waited for letters that never came. By February of 1935, their growing anxiety had turned to dread. They organized a search, and a posse led by the commissioner of Escalante, Utah, rode into the canyons that had been Everett's last known sanctuary. What they found was not a scene of struggle or violence. It was a place of quiet, chilling abandonment. In a side canyon known as Davis Gulch, a mere slit in the colossal sandstone, they found his camp. It was a ghost camp. A small corral made of brush stood empty. A few footprints, preserved by the cold, dry earth, marked his last steps. His personal effects were left as if their owner had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. A book of poetry by Oscar Wilde, his box of watercolors and brushes, his sleeping bag, even his wallet containing a small amount of cash. It was a scene of perfect order, a life interrupted mid-thought. The scale of the place was terrifying. The red rock walls of Davis Gulch rose like cathedral spires, ancient and indifferent to the fate of the single small life that had sought refuge among them. The wind, the only constant companion, whispered through the narrow passages, carrying no answers. The searchers called his name, their voices swallowed by the stone, the echoes dying before they could travel far. They scoured the ledges, peered into crevices, but the landscape that Everett had so loved seemed to have absorbed him without a trace. Then they found his final message. It wasn't in a letter, but carved into the soft sandstone of a hidden alcove, a place he had called his home. 3 words, a signature that would echo through history, fueling a mystery that has endured for nearly a century. Nemo, 1934. Nemo, Latin for no one. Was it a reference to Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's brilliant, enigmatic recluse who turned his back on civilization to live in a self-made world of beauty and isolation? It was a character Everett deeply admired. Or was it something darker? A final piece of art, a declaration of rebirth, the shedding of one identity to embrace the vast, anonymous soul of the desert itself. He had entered the wild to lose himself in its grandeur, but no one could have imagined how literally he would succeed. The desert holds its stories close, but some are too powerful to remain buried. If you are drawn to these true accounts of the human spirit pushed to its absolute limit, your support with a like helps us continue these expeditions into the past. To understand the silence Everett Ruess left behind, you must first understand the life he was so desperately trying to build. He was not an explorer in the conventional sense, chasing fame, fortune, or scientific discovery. He was a pilgrim on a quest for a cathedral made of stone and sky. Born in 1914, Everett was the product of a unique and restless household. His parents, Christopher and Stella, were artists, poets, and intellectuals, Unitarians who believed that divinity was not found in a church, but in nature, art, and the untethered human spirit. Their home was not a fixed point on a map, but a series of waypoints across America, from the Pacific coast to the streets of New York. While the Great Depression was forcing millions into lives of quiet desperation and conformity,
the Ruess family preached a gospel of fierce independence. They raised their sons, Everett and Waldo, to believe that the richest life was one lived on one's own terms, far from the suffocating confines and predictable rhythms of modern society. Everett took this lesson to heart, perhaps more literally than even his parents intended. From a young age, he felt the pull of the wild as a physical force. While other boys his age were confined to classrooms, Everett was already apprenticing himself to the mountains and the desert. He spent his teenage years testing his limits in the high Sierras, learning the silent language of the trail, the bite of the wind, the weight of a pack. He was a gifted artist, his block prints capturing the stark, powerful lines of the landscapes he loved. He was also a prolific writer, and his letters home were not simple updates. They were manifestos of a soul utterly intoxicated by beauty. He wrote of the unabashed, untamed beauty of the wilderness, declaring, "I have not been lonely, I have been in the heart of the world." For him, civilization was a cage, its comforts a form of anesthetic for a life half-lived. He was methodically, passionately filing through the bars. By the time he was 20, he had already accumulated a lifetime of wandering. He had walked and hitchhiked through Yosemite and the Big Sur coast, traded his artwork for a meal, and slept under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. He journeyed deep into Arizona, living among the Navajo and Hopi people, not as a tourist, but as a student. He admired their profound connection to the land, a spiritual harmony he felt was lost to the modern world. But with each journey, his desire for deeper immersion grew more intense. He was no longer content to be a visitor in the wilderness. He wanted to dissolve into it, to become an inseparable part of its fabric. It was during this period that he began carving a new name for himself into the rock, wood, and cliff dwellings he passed: Nemo, Latin for no one. This was no mere trail name. It was a profound philosophical declaration. He was actively shedding the identity of Everett Ruess, son of Christopher, and becoming an anonymous element of the landscape itself, as nameless and as essential as a canyon wren or a juniper tree. It was the ultimate rejection of ego, a quest to disappear into the whole. In the autumn of 1934, this quest for dissolution reached its apex. He arrived in the remote Mormon outpost of Escalante, Utah, a dusty, windswept town that served as the last gasp of civilization before the plunge into some of the most formidable and unmapped territory in North America. The landscape here was different, more ancient and more menacing. It was a labyrinth of sandstone canyons, a maze of stone and silence that had swallowed men before, leaving not even a bone behind. The locals, seasoned ranchers who understood the desert's unforgiving calculus, likely warned the bright-eyed young man about the coming winter, about flash floods that could turn a dry wash into a raging torrent in minutes, about the sheer, disorienting scale of the country he was about to enter. Everett was not intimidated. He was enchanted. This was the altar he had been seeking. With his 2 burros, named Chocolate and Cockleburr, loaded with meager supplies, some flour, bacon, a bedroll, his paints, and his journals, he prepared to walk into the heart of the Escalante Canyons. He told the few people he met that he planned to be gone for 2 months, perhaps longer. He was searching, he said, for the perfect canyon, a place of such profound beauty and isolation that he might never want to leave. On November 11, 1934, he penned a final ecstatic letter to his parents. It contained no hint of fear, no premonition of doom. It was a song of praise, filled with vibrant descriptions of the raw, magnificent country and his own boundless joy. Then he guided his burros past the last dusty corral, past the final line of civilization, and walked into the vast, silent, and hungry emptiness. For the first few days, the emptiness was not empty at all. It was a cathedral of silence, a canvas of infinite light, and it sang a song only he could hear. The desert answered Everett's call with a profound sense of belonging.
His journals, which we can only imagine, must have been filled with frantic sketches of twisted juniper trees and watercolors of canyon walls bleeding crimson and ochre in the dying sun. He was not just observing beauty, he was consuming it, living his art. Each footstep was a line in a poem, each sip of water from a hidden moss-lined spring a sacrament. The grit of sand under his fingernails, the smoky taste of bacon cooked over a crackling juniper fire, the overwhelming, diamond-hard blanket of stars at night. These were not hardships, but confirmations of his liberation. He was not a visitor here, he was a pilgrim who had finally reached his shrine. The loneliness he had craved was a physical presence, a warm companion that walked beside him, assuring him that the world of men, with its noise, its clocks, and its demands, was a fading, irrelevant dream. About a week into his journey, near a place called Davis Gulch, his perfect solitude was briefly interrupted. He crossed paths with two shepherders, men whose faces were maps of the very landscape Everett was romanticizing, their skin like cracked leather. They were weathered, pragmatic, and deeply unimpressed by the boy poet and his two burros. They shared a meal with him, a brief communion between two entirely different species of desert dweller. To them, this land was a workplace, a harsh and fickle master that demanded constant respect and vigilance. To Everett, it was a lover, a source of mystical ecstasy. They warned him, their words sparse and heavy, about the coming winter, about the north wind that could freeze a man in his sleep, about the scarcity of forage for his animals. He listened, smiled politely, and spoke of beauty and light. They saw a young man dangerously naive, a lamb walking into a lion's den with a song on his lips. He saw them as relics of a world he was trying to escape. After they parted ways, watching his small figure recede into the vastness, Everett Ruess was never reliably seen by another human being again. Now the silence began to change its character. It was no longer a comforting blanket, but a vast, ringing void that pressed in on his eardrums. The sheer scale of the landscape began to assert its dominance. Canyons that looked like simple cracks from a distance revealed themselves to be labyrinthine traps miles deep, with sheer walls that blocked out the sun for most of the day, plunging him into premature twilight. A wrong turn didn't mean losing an hour, it could mean losing days or everything. His burros, his only companions, grew thin as good grazing became harder to find, their steps less certain, their sad eyes a constant reproach. The daily rituals, finding water, making camp, tending to his animals, became less a romantic adventure and more a relentless, grinding necessity. The desert was no longer just a passive canvas for his art. It was an active participant in his life, a force with its own ancient, indifferent will that dictated his every move with absolute authority. His mind, once soaring with poetic ideals, was forced to narrow its focus to the brutal calculus of survival. How many miles to the next potential water source? How much flour is left in the sack? Is that a storm cloud building on the horizon, threatening a flash flood that could turn his peaceful canyon into a watery tomb in minutes? Paranoia is a survival tool in such a place, a necessary sharpening of the senses. Every shadow could hide a mountain lion. Every loose rock underfoot could mean a broken leg, a slow and agonizing death sentence in a place where no one would ever hear a scream. The ecstatic joy of solitude was inevitably poisoned by the primal terror of absolute isolation. There is a fine line between being alone and being lost, and Everett was walking it every single day, the line growing thinner with each passing sunset. The ancient petroglyphs on the canyon walls, once a source of wonder, might have started to feel like watching eyes in the flickering firelight. It was somewhere in this period, in the heart of his magnificent and terrifying isolation, that he left his most famous and enigmatic clue. In a small, protected alcove, a place of ancient Anasazi ruins, he carved two words into the soft sandstone wall: Nemo, 1934. Nemo, Latin for no one. Was it a playful, defiant nod to Captain Nemo, the solitary, brilliant anti-hero of 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas? Another man who turned his back on civilization to create his own world? A declaration that he too was master of his own wild domain, beholden to no one? Or was it something deeper, more final? A declaration of his new identity, or rather, his new non-identity. He was no longer Everett Ruess, the son, the brother, the artist from California. He was becoming no one, a nameless spirit dissolving into the landscape he adored. It was both a signature and an erasure, a final cryptic message from a man who was systematically severing every tie to his former life, preparing to take one final step into the unknown. It was his last piece of art, a self-portrait not of his face, but of his soul, etched into the stone for eternity. From that stone, he turned away. The act was complete. The man who had entered the alcove was gone, and in his place stood Nemo, a specter in the sun-bleached wilderness, unburdened by a past, unbound by a future. There must have been a terrifying lightness in that moment, the severing of the final thread connecting him to everything he had ever been. He was a ghost before he was dead, a walking embodiment of the desert's vast, impersonal soul. What happened next is a void, a vacuum in history that has been filled with desperate theories, each more haunting than the last. Did he continue his walk, pushing deeper into the labyrinth of canyons and make one fatal misstep? The Slick Rock landscape is a place of profound deception. A ledge that appears solid can crumble to sand under a single boot. A dry wash can become a raging, inescapable torrent in minutes from a storm miles away. One can almost see it, the crumbling edge of a precipice, a foot placed on stone that was not as solid as it seemed. A sudden, heart-stopping lurch as the world pivots, the turquoise sky replaced by rushing red rock. A fall not of seconds, but of a lifetime, ending in the silent, indifferent dust of a canyon floor. There, broken and alone, with the vulture circling as black specks against an uncaring sun, his existence would have faded, a secret the buzzards and the wind would keep forever. Or was the danger not from the earth, but from the man who walked upon it? The 1930s Utah frontier was a lawless place, a refuge for those fleeing the desperation of the Great Depression. Cattle rustlers, prospectors with nothing left to lose, and desperate men haunted these remote corridors. Perhaps Everett, in his idealistic solitude, stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see. A hidden steal brewing illegal liquor, a stolen herd being driven through a secret pass. The encounter would have been brutal and swift. His romantic view of the world colliding with the cold, hard reality of men for whom survival was the only creed. A tense exchange, a misunderstanding, or simply the cold calculation that a witness could not be left alive. A gunshot that echoed once off the canyon walls and then was swallowed by the immense silence. His body buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. His existence erased, not by choice, but by violence. His story ending not in poetry, but in blood. But there is a third possibility, one that whispers in the margins of his letters and poems. The possibility that he simply succeeded, that he walked out of Davis Gulch, leaving his burrows, his tools, his name, and everything that tethered him to our world behind. He followed a hidden trail, a secret invitation from the landscape itself, and found what he was looking for, a final, perfect dissolution. Perhaps he was taken in by a reclusive Navajo family, living a new life under a new name, the legend of his disappearance a private smile he carried for decades. Or perhaps his end was more elemental. He walked until his body gave out, and then lay down beneath the stars he so loved, letting the wind and the sand reclaim him, his body becoming the beauty he had spent his life chasing. A conscious act of becoming nobody, and therefore becoming everything. This wasn't an end, but a transfiguration. For months, the desert kept its silence. Back in the civilized world, concern curdled into panic. By February 1935, the search was officially on. A seasoned commissioner from Escalante, a man named Marion Lamb, who knew the unforgiving nature of this land, led a party into the labyrinth. For 3 agonizing weeks, they scoured the canyons, their calls swallowed by the stone, their hopes dwindling with each passing sunset. The terrain fought them at every turn, a maze designed to conceal, not reveal. And then they found it. In the narrow, winding confines of Davis Gulch, they discovered Everett's 2 burrows, peacefully grazing in a makeshift corral of brush, trapped but otherwise unharmed and in good condition. Nearby was his camp, a scene of almost supernatural stillness. His tools, his paints, his cooking gear, his books, all were in order, as if he had just stepped away for a moment to gather firewood. Everything was there, a perfect tableau of his life. His sleeping bag laid out, a copy of a poetry anthology by his bed, his easel waiting for a canvas. But the man himself was gone. The discovery only deepened the mystery. A man lost in a panic wouldn't have carefully corralled his animals. A man who had fallen wouldn't have left his camp so neatly arranged. And a man who had been murdered would likely have had his valuable gear stolen by his killers. It was the camp of a person who intended to return. Yet the evidence of his final carving, Nemo, screamed of a man who was leaving forever. The searchers stood in the profound silence, the weight of the contradiction pressing down on them. They looked up at the towering canyon walls, at the endless empty sky. They were standing in the middle of an answer they couldn't comprehend. Everett Ruess had not just gotten lost. He had evaporated. The official search was eventually called off as winter's icy grip began to close on the high desert. The vast, indifferent landscape had yielded nothing but questions. But for his family, the search never truly ended. His parents, Christopher and Stella, and his brother Waldo would spend the rest of their lives chasing shadows, funding private expeditions, and following every rumor that drifted out of the canyons. Their grief transformed into a decades-long vigil, a search not for a body, but for an answer that would grant them peace. This personal quest, fueled by love and loss, kept the flame of his memory alive, elevating his story from a local tragedy to an enduring American myth. From this void of information, 3 dominant theories emerged, each attempting to impose a human logic onto the desert's silence. The first, and most straightforward, was a simple accident. The canyons are a landscape of beautiful treachery. He could have been climbing a sheer cliff face, reaching for a better view, when the friable sandstone crumbled beneath his fingers. A single misstep could have sent him plunging into a deep, hidden crevice, his body forever concealed from the sun. Or perhaps he was caught in a flash flood, a sudden, violent wall of water that can scour a canyon clean in minutes, erasing any trace of life. This explained the absence of a body, but it failed to account for the deliberate order of his camp, or the finality of that single word, Nemo. The second theory was darker: murder. The Utah desert during the Great Depression was not an empty paradise. It was a harsh, lawless frontier, a refuge for desperate men. Cattle rustlers operated in the shadows of the mesas, and a lone traveler with 2 valuable burros and a pack full of supplies would have been a tempting target. This explained the absence of a body, but it failed to account for the deliberate order of his camp, or the finality of that single word, Nemo. The second theory was darker: murder. Rumors swirled for years: a deathbed confession heard in a bar, a skeleton found by a prospector, stories of a young man shot over a water dispute. Investigators followed these leads, but they always dissolved into hearsay. And the central contradiction remained. Why would murderers kill him but leave his valuable gear behind? It didn't fit the cold logic of crime. This leaves the third and most compelling possibility, the one that aligns perfectly with the boy who wrote, "I have not been able to escape the lure of the wild." The theory that Everett Ruess did not die at all, but simply succeeded.
He had written about his desire to vanish and plunge into the pure wilderness, that he walked out of his old life and into a new one, nameless and free. He had become Nemo, nobody, a man who had shed the skin of his identity to merge completely with the landscape he adored. He might have lived out his days on a remote Navajo reservation where stories persist of a lonely white man who married into a local family. Or he simply kept walking south, a ghost moving through the landscape until he was a different person in a different country. In this version of the story, there is no tragedy. There is only the ultimate act of self-determination, a final, perfect escape. For 75 years, the mystery held, hardening into legend. Then, in 2009, a stunning announcement sent shockwaves through the community of Ruess followers. A skeleton had been found years earlier in a remote crevice, and a preliminary DNA test comparing samples to those of Everett's living relatives seemed to confirm it was him. The media seized the story. After 3/4 of a century, the mystery was solved. Everett Ruess had died, tragically but conventionally, from an accident. There was a collective sense of closure, a bittersweet end to the long vigil. But the desert was not finished. The initial findings came under scrutiny. More rigorous, subsequent DNA tests were conducted by the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, and the conclusion was unequivocal. The first test was wrong. The bones belonged to someone else, likely a Native American. Everett Ruess had once again slipped through the world's grasp. The desert pulled its veil of silence back over him, reclaiming its mystery with an almost defiant finality. In the end, perhaps the concrete answer doesn't matter as much as the profound question he left behind. Everett Ruess went into the wilderness searching for an absolute beauty, a truth that could not be found in the noise of civilization. He may have found it in a moment of sublime terror at the edge of a cliff, or in the quiet dignity of a chosen anonymity. What is certain is that he became the author of his own myth. He wrote the opening chapters with his ecstatic letters and his art, and he wrote the final, silent chapter by walking off the page of history entirely. He is no longer just a missing person. He is an idea. He represents the untamable American spirit, the eternal tension between society and the wild, and the radical notion that one can choose to simply stop. In a world that demands we are always seen, always connected, always known, his story is a haunting whisper of a different possibility. He is a permanent resident of the wild places, his name carried on the wind that scours the sandstone canyons. He is the boy who loved the world so much, he decided to become part of it forever. The past is full of warnings and lessons of profound value. Subscribe so you don't miss the next expedition into the unknown.